As the long, soiled beige bus pulled into the lot, the guards on both sides sprung open a massive rolling chained gate. Don watched from a rear window as he saw men in green outfits and orange toboggans moving around throughout the small compound. Don exited the bus with his personal belongings in hand and was escorted to an old dormitory that housed about 20 men. There was no one in sight that Don recognized from out in the world, so he kept to himself. Nightfall came, and Don slept with one eye open. It didn't matter if he was at a minimum work-released camp or a supermax. Don always stayed alert and ahead of all danger. Sunrise came, and the smell of fresh country bacon and eggs lingered throughout the dorm as the men started popping up one by one to get dressed to head out to the mess hall. Some men walk in groups, some in couples, but Don walked alone, sliding his tray down the counter in the mess hall, being served with scoops of fresh breakfast. An old man serving on the line kept shouting out, with a wicked laugh. He looked in Don's eyes and saw no fear and whispered to him to come back to the kitchen to get a job. The next day, Don walked in the kitchen and met with Mr. Andy, who was the prison steward. Mr. Andy was an old trustee who was grandfathered in under old law. Therefore, he had say-so and pull on who he wanted working in the kitchen with him. He saw something in Don. Mr. Andy, a big, black, brawly countryman with gigantic hands who would always grip men by their collarbones, that was his way of showing brotherly love. He would constantly stir huge pots of weird, strange sauces and marinades. That was his thing, stirring and tasting as he cooked for a sea full of convicts. Every afternoon and night, Don would leave the mess hall and head back to his dormitory, ready for a hot shower and good night's sleep. The mess hall was a lot of work, with constantly prepping and preparing meals 2 to 3 times each and every day. Don never worked in the kitchen throughout his entire journey through corrections. He always heard from other men that the kitchen was the silver lining gig for a man to have behind the wall. He always did porter jobs and his own side hustles, from drawings, peddling snacks, coffee and tobacco, and loan sharing. Don just looked at the mess hall gig as a sign of gratitude for making it to minimum release. As the crisp air cut like sharp paper, the sound of clashing metal and cigarette smoke filled the air. An early morning group of men huddled around a salvaged, taped-up padded bench, taking turns bench-pressing huge wheels of iron. Bets were constantly who could do the most bench presses. MJ was the killer comedian in crowd, a high yellow Carolina native who moved to L.A. and joined the Crips. He was a short, funny guy, but as dangerous as they come. He would make everyone laugh. He was a good jokester. MJ worked in the kitchen as well, and him and Don became good friends. MJ gave Don the rundown on Andy, and he showed Don how to smuggle food back into the dormitory at night. And Friday evenings throughout the weekend is when the men would purchase food for their weekend events and festivities. Fried chicken and breakfast sandwiches were the premium of list. The lights went out, and Don laid in his bed with his hands folded behind his head, mentally crossing off the days he had left before his release. Morning came, and all one heard were chains, keys, and feet shuffling at a loud and rapid rate. Don woke up to men standing throughout the dormitory with roll-ups in hand. A Caucasian man stood in front of his bunk with fear in hid eyes as he looked at Don on the bottom bunk, sitting up with his boots tied tight and both feet planted on the floor. Don stood up firm, as if he was squaring up with the young Caucasian boy. The timid white boy introduced himself as Mack. Don just pointed to the top bunk where all novice inmates sleep in the prison system. The captain shouted, "Fresh meat has arrived. If I hear about any one of these new guys having a problem with anyone in this house, the entire house will burn." And he left the dormitory with his fellow officers behind him. Breakfast detail was approaching in a couple of hours, so Don groomed himself in the bathroom with a wash and razor shave. A month had passed, and Don and Mack became a team. Over the course of Don's stint, he'd learned that a man was a man first before his nationality. Also, Don had mastered the pimp game and was always eager to make an effort to play on any individual fitting the description. Mack had fit that description, but Don was all about pimping with a sleight of hand, meaning he would play fair until he sensed a cross coming. And just like magic, Mack would smuggle sandwiches and loads of fried chicken back to the dormitory. The weekends were fulfilling. Men betted on sports, played all types of card and board games. Bets were placed on calisthenics and anything a man could bet on. Visits were conducted during the days, but at night, Don and Mack owned the dormitory. Food was everywhere and made the atmosphere exciting. Everyone ate, could even the men who couldn't afford to buy the food from Don and Mack. Don gave it to them on consignment with a promissory note to pay on their next money drawing date. MJ slowly faded out the picture since he was fired from the kitchen for disrespecting Andy by constantly mocking his country accent and getting caught with stealing food. MJ didn't like Mack, he was prejudiced. Don kept MJ close, which would diffuse any thoughts of jealousy and snitching, so he would give MJ free sandwiches at times and shoot the breeze with him on a normal basis. They were both workout partners on the weight pile, so Don kept his friendship with MJ intact. The next day on the weight pile, MJ introduced Don to a guy named Razor, a native New Jersey man who committed murder on the first degree the first day he came to visit his grandmother and cousins. Razor's mother, Athena, had instantly moved down when he caught his time. Athena, better known as Miss A, ran a halfway house, a ministry, that gave a fresh start for men returning back into world from prison. She and Larry Lozoff, a famous author and Hindu spiritual guru, used to go back and forth at it, seeking to win convicts over to join their ministries. Razor would help his mama over the years by sending men reaching release to her ministry, and in return, his mama would try to find young women to date Razor while being behind bars to ease the lengthy time he was serving. Razor went to his locker and pulled out his goose-down North Face ski jacket and gave it to Bull, a man set to walk out the front gates any day now. Who would head to Miss A's ministry? Hours passed, and the time had come for Bull to re-enter into the world, and off he went. Razor Mama's ministry. And in a news flash, the word got back to the joint that Bull had burned Razor's mama. Bull never got a job. He had brung women to the ministry during the wee hours of the night, and he left with the North Face jacket never to be seen again. So that was a slap in the face to Razor and his mama. Razor was pissed because Bull was his bunkmate for 3 years now at the minimum release prison camp. He never Bull pulling a move on him like this. It was like a complete Survivors TV series. The entire prison was aware and interested in seeing who would make it out there in the world or return. Many men got busted back. They walked right back in those gates to serve new sentences on new charges. It was an ongoing, deadly, and fearful cycle. Don watched MJ constantly walking around the compound, repeating Razor and his mama's business and what Bull had pulled on them. Don wished MJ would put a cap on his mouth because he drafted up plans for Mack and him to go to the ministry as well upon release. Mack time was short and he was next up, so he asked Don to put a bug in Razor's ear about landing at the ministry with a promise Don would follow behind his footsteps. Don pulled MJ to the side and told him about the plan to get to Razor. MJ said, "I'm not about to vouch for no white boy. Nah, not this Long Beach crip." In the middle of MJ's spat, Don shoved 2 quarter-sized chicken sandwiches in MJ's prison jacket pocket, and the deal was made. The sun was out early this morning, with no mercy on the weight pile, as small group of men lifted iron in simultaneously in sets of 10. Razor lit up his cigarette and told Don he wanted to take a walk on the compound's smoke trail so he could converse with him about what MJ told him. The 2 men walked and talked, and Razor promised he would have his mama Miss A up to the prison in a few days to interview Don. Cleaning out the hot steam table in the kitchen as the crowd of men dispersed back to their sleep quarters, Mack signaled Don that he was ready for the food drop. Don shook his head in a no motion, which his eyes read, "You're too short," meaning that Mack was set to be released any day now. Don made a wise decision. He looked at Miss A's place as his meal ticket and Mack as his pond upon re-entering society. Several days passed, and Mack's name was called. Don gave him a hug for good luck, while MJ looked on in disgust as he said, "Yeah, bye-bye cracker." Mack threw up his middle finger to MJ and disappeared out of the front gates into the world. Weeks had passed, and Don would interrupt Razor and his mama's phone call to see if his plan worked and how Mack was doing on the outside. Razor would just be brief with Don and repeat whatever his mama told him, which Don felt was some gibberish. This process went on back and forth for several weeks until Don's name was called for release. Razor and MJ hugged Don and wished him all kinds of luck. Don was focused and nervous at the same time. He never felt the feeling of having his freedom and rights restored. The prison guard was standing firm in front of a small state pickup truck in a defense stance, although without a shotgun in hand. He called Don over, and he helped place his bags in the bed of the truck. The two drove off away from the compound, down 85 South to Durham. Reaching Durham's west end, the pickup truck stopped, and the correctional office removed Don's bags and just dropped them on the curb and pulled off. Don picked up his belongings and knocked on the door of a shabby mustard-yellow ranch home as he shouted, "Miss A! Miss A!" Don heard massive footsteps getting louder and louder approaching the door. It opened, and the 400-pound plus-size nappy-headed woman smiled ear to ear, missing several teeth. Don gave the huge lady a hug and walked in the house. Right away, he noticed the messy rooms throughout and how cold it was. Miss A had sat Don down right away to discuss the current state and status of the ministry. She explained, due to past recent incidents and what Bull just did, the ministry's funds were so depleted it will eventually close its doors. Don fell for the game, but over the next few days, he saw different. Now, being on the outside of the prison gates, he realized Miss A was using the men back at Orange County minimum release to support her lifestyle and pay for her son Razor's attorney fees. It all made sense now. Don was a man of his word to Razor and didn't want any division in ministry. So the very first task was to kick the man in the first bedroom out of the house. Miss A gave Don a brief rundown on the tenant in the front room who installed a latch and lock on the bedroom's door. Then she went on into explaining the rules of the ministry and how no tenants can install locks on doors, and every man must go out and seek employment 5 days a week. Don noticed right away the flaws in her program's rules. He decided to sit down on the front porch and soak all of this new beginning of a life. Meanwhile, thinking in the past of he was a young fly getting money, nigga, and how could he restore his life back better than his past? Mack walked up, breaking Don's daydream. He ran up to Don and hugged him like he haven't seen him in years. "I knew you would make it. I knew it," Mack said. Mack told Don about the guy in the first bedroom, how he ran all over Miss A and her rules, and how she begged him not to harm the guy. Mack explained how the guy works and come and goes as he pleases, bringing different women to the ministry. Don calmly put his anger to the side, and his pimp hands started twitching, meaning he had a brilliant plan. Don went back in the house with Mack right behind him, and he kicked the latched bedroom door open. There were a row of tennis shoes and boots there. Don quickly gave Mack a pair of boots and said, "Try these on." Don grabbed 2 pair of boots for himself, which played heavily on his conscience because he wasn't a thief. In this moment, he moved on what he felt was right. The guy came home from work, and all hell broke loose. Don stood on the front porch, blocking his entry into the house. Don told the man he couldn't live in the house no more unless he was willing to die for his respect to live there. Same rules applied in the prison. The man backed down, and it just came over Don that this guy wasn't a ministry intake from prison. He was a homeless user. He was using Miss A for her kindness, and thought, well, maybe they were using each other, and he got the best of her. The heat of the moment had rise, and the man disappeared and reappeared with the Durham Police Department at Miss A's front door. Don stood his ground as the protector of the house, as Mack stood next to him with support. Miss A backed Don as she politely told the police that the young man can get his things and leave. The guy cleared his room in a heartbeat and walked off the porch, threatening and promising Don he would see him another day when he least suspected it. Don just stared with a cold-blooded, killer pimp look without a blink. Morning came, and Mack was at the kitchen table, asking about what was the plan for making their lives better immediately. Mack trusted Don with his life from back in prison, due to the fact Don kept all the niggers off his ass. Mack was a military soldier who was dishonorable discharged and caught a slew of domestic charges over a hot red-headed big boob gal he was over the hills with, which landed him at the prison camp. Don went into his state's clear travel bag, basically a huge clear plastic garbage, they give all released inmates to carry their belongings. He pulled out several folded-up papers and some yellow legal-sized writing tablets with names and numbers on them he had collected over the years throughout his state-to-state penitentiary journey. Don was so deep-seated into flipping his hustle game, trading it in for a new game, the pimp game, he would practice his game on other men day and night. He would retrieve their entire identities and their information. He figured, what do they care? They have life sentences. Don left and went the corner store to use the payphone. He gave the address and fictitious name, social, and date of birth to Bell South M, and in minutes he had communication set up. I walked fast back to the ministry through the winter crisp, cold air. Miss A had an old non-working plastic telephone. Don told Mack to plug the phone line into the wall jack as he placed the phone to his ear, hearing a clear Dale tone. Don phoned his mama and the line rang as he heard a soft, excited voice. Mack stood by watching in awe. In his mind, he felt ever more secured and positive about his friendship with Don was a blessing from God sent to him while he was once in a dark space in his life. Don and his mother spoke for an hour discussing his future and how he needed his mom to send a care package of fresh new winter clothes because he needed to prepare for his climb back to the top of society. Don moved on the next mission at hand and created an account with Duke Power, and quickly running hot water and lights were functional in the ministry. Miss A swore that Don was a gift sent from her son Razor. She was able to talk to Razor for hours, as in the past. The only thing was Don wanted to see if she would pay the bill. The jailhouse was praising Don and Mack. MJ was still being MJ, being a clown and talking bad behind other men back. The word got back to Don even. MJ was classifying Don as a stand-up heroic man after taking control for the good of the ministry. The heart of the winter started settling in fast. Don and Mack would job hunt and travel by bus to all the local libraries. The University of Chapel Hill's library was the preferred location. It was vast and hosted many computers for research and surfing the web. Don and Mack attended the library so often that the security labeled them as regulars. Don had family in Chapel Hill since the last time he could remember visiting one time in the past. His cousin LaRon was a famous carpenter in Chapel Hill. MJ kept bragging about him so much, Don had no choice but to befriend MJ and gain all the insight of his cousin's whereabouts in Chapel Hill. Don went into a room full of telephone books and researched the last name Ingram, his Aunt Laura, which was his cousin LaRon's mama. Don figured someone could get a hold of LaRon, it would be Auntie Laura. Running his finger down and through the letter I, last names, and bingo, he landed on Laura Ingram, 91970711936. The library was closing in minutes, so Don rushed the number down on a back of his prison identification and stepped out in the winter mixed weather, heading home. To be continued.